All right, keeping on our theme of livability success stories. Next, we're going to go to Dr. Hyatt Frobose. Hyatt serves as Commercial Director for North America for Gestation Technologies. With that, Hyatt's going to talk to us about what does success in open pen gestation look like, a cross-section of USA sow farms. Please help me welcome Hyatt to the stage.
Forward, backward, there's the pointer.
That's forward.
Yeah, there you go.
Thank you.
You betcha.
I'm going to try to hold still. I'm not quite as caffeinated as PJ is, but it's a pleasure to be up here with such a prestigious group of speakers and PJ. And we're really glad to be able to share some data with you from the Gestation side of things. When the organizers of this event asked me to present some of this information this past spring, I kind of thought back to myself that I have a lot of opinions and a decent amount of experience on pen gestation, but some of the questions that I think you guys would like to see some answers to, we want to substantiate this with some data. So I thought it'd be a good opportunity for us to take the cross-section of some of the farms that we have in the U.S. system and ask some questions of those people that have been using it for a while and maybe try to learn some of the real data from that. So as we go through the data that I'm going to share with you today from the survey we generated, first, just going to give you a little more background on who we are as Gestation Technologies, go through some of the key principles of open pen gestation for those of you that aren't quite as familiar with it, how we designed our survey, some of the results and conclusions of our survey as well. So as I was introduced, Gestation Technologies is a company that I work for. I serve as the Commercial Director for North America. We're based in Quebec, Canada, hence the Giga French pronunciation. Many of you know our products as Gestation. That would be the precision feeding systems that we make and manufacture for growing pigs as well as sows. We're going to focus today more on the pen gestating sow side of things. We have an ESF system that a lot of you guys in the audience have some exposure to, but just for perspective, we're in about 400,000 sows in the U.S. market today. So within that 400,000 sows, wanted to get some information within reason of what we could learn from the existing farms we've got. For some of the key principles of open pen gestation, commonly known as OPG by a lot of you guys in the audience. These are just a list of some of the factors that we often want to really focus on as we're working on retrofits or new construction with pen gestation, asking customers or prospects some of these questions so that we can make sure we design your farm for success. That being said, I'll be the first to admit there's a few of these that I wouldn't say there's a black and white right answer. There's some gray in that, right? And some that's going to depend on what you've got going in your particular farm situation. And I thought this would be a great opportunity as we design this survey to ask some of these questions and maybe get a little bit more substantiation to some of the things that we've seen over time. Somebody said earlier today, "In God we trust, all other things bring data." There are a few of these questions that I thought this was a great opportunity to maybe substantiate further. Just to step back a little bit, I haven't seen Ron Ketchum in the audience, but he used to be at a lot of these types of events, and I believe the last group housing survey that I'm familiar with in the U.S. was from Ron Ketchum and SMS back in 2012, and Gestation wasn't even in the market in 2012, so things have obviously changed a lot since then, but here's a little bit of a flashback there to some of the data that we had from crated sows and pen sows in 2012, and I know Ron and SMS had plans to repeat this in 2017. I'm not sure if that really got done, but I know for many years he was giving me a hard time because I didn't have this data to share and contribute with him. So I guess for Ron somewhere out there, I got some of this data for you now. For the survey goals for this, we really want to achieve it. We wanted to achieve an adequate cross-section of normal U.S. sow farms. We've got some systems that have 10, 15 farms with our system. I didn't think that was maybe necessarily the best cross-section, but wanted to get some information from a lot of different farms with different management styles. And we also wanted to get this from a data period long enough to indicate true performance. We settled on January 1 to June 30th of this year, being current, but also representing some of the differences in seasonality that we see in different parts of the U.S. We wanted to combine on-farm answers from the farm workers and managers with some substantiated data that we were able to retrieve from the Gestation software on their farm. And long-term, we want to develop some data-supported guidance for future farm retrofits and new construction. And the picture on the right is a Jenga tower. I was playing with my kids one day, and I've used this analogy a lot of times, but in my experience, pen gestation is a lot like a Jenga tower. There's a lot of pieces to success, and to be honest, you can do a few things wrong and probably still get along okay, but there's a tipping point where if you do too many things wrong, the whole thing can come crashing down on you. And so I think that analogy generally applies to a lot of group housing systems. So first of all, we made sure to check with the farms that we got the data from that they agreed in advance to participate in this survey. And then I asked each of my team members on my Gestal team to take about 10 farms and go through these surveys with farms in their territories. And so they did that once the data from January to June was available. So that data was collected in July and August of this year. We asked each of them about 50 questions, ranging from general farm info to pen design questions, pen management questions, as well as some things especially about hospital animal management. I think hospitalization techniques is one of the areas that I see a lot of differences amongst systems, but I think all of you in the audience can agree that it's important, especially when we focus on sow mortality today. And then my reps logged into those farms and actually pulled the data from the Gestal reports to try to validate some of those answers or refute them if necessary so we could clarify and make sure we had the right answers for this data set. I won't go through every one of these questions, but here's just a list of some of the information we asked. So I really appreciate the farms that were willing to participate in this data collection because it took some time and we had to pull some data from a lot of these farms, but ultimately we felt it was important to be able to get a comprehensive data set. As we went to validating that data, these were some of the things that we were able to pull from the Gestal data, just a snapshot to the right of sows that hadn't eaten in a day or what percentage of sows were eating, some of the things that we could retrieve with access to their farms once we had their approval. So for the part that you guys are most interested in, a little more about the sows that we specifically looked at. We originally targeted 40 sow farms. We didn't quite get 40 done in the time frame. We got 38, a total of 122,000 sows. That was from 13 U.S. states ranging from Pennsylvania to Montana to Oklahoma. So I think a pretty good cross-section of the sow farms in the U.S. and where they're located. The average mated inventory of those farms was about 3,200 sows, with our smallest farm in the data set being 1,300 and largest being 6,880. Of those farms, we had 9 of the top 25 pork powerhouses represented, as well as 13 independent producers. I already told you guys about the data period we collected this. One thing that made it a little challenging for us to get to 40 farms was we excluded any farms that had a PRRS break during those months. And as many of you guys experienced last winter, in spring, we had a lot of PRRS breaks. So we actually had to go back from the first 40 farms that we targeted, and we ended up having to go to about 60 until we found 40 that didn't have a PRRS break or a PED break in the spring of 2025. So 18 of our initial farms were excluded just for that reason. So a lot of you guys have been talking about PRRS and PRRS elimination strategies. I'm looking forward to you guys finding the answers to that because designing pen gestation is a little easier than that solution. But we also excluded any farms that had OPG, open pen gestation, for less than 2 years, as we felt they really weren't probably out of that stabilization after the initial remodel or new construction. So to summarize those farms, this is kind of mimicking what Ron Ketchum's data had mimicked or had described. I think this matches up pretty well with Dr. Turner's data as far as the best 25% of the farms we analyzed were just over 30 pigs per mated female per year, while the bottom end was averaging about 26. For conception rate, farrowing rate, we averaged 91 and 85%. Sow mortality on the low end, the best farms were about 8%. The poorer farms averaged 17 with an average of 13.2, and we're really going to focus on sow mortality with some of the rest of these results, even though we have some other information on all these farms as well. I think that labor component has been something that I've heard many times throughout the day today, but again, kind of smack dab with what Dr. Turner illustrated. The average farm in our data set was about 300, just over 300 sows per staff member, with a range on the low end of 250 to the high end of about 350. We used Pearson correlation coefficients in R to estimate the strength of these relationships between two variables, and our key outputs were sow mortality, fallout rate in pens, farrowing rate, and pigs per mated female per year. Again, for lack of time, and I think for the focus of today on survivability, we really focused on the sow mortality component for the presentation today. There were some of the questions we asked where we really didn't have enough variation in our answers. So just for example, we asked all the participants if they ever reintroduce sows into pens after they've been hospitalized or pulled because of various reasons. And I think 3 out of our 38 farms reintroduce sows to pens at times. So some of those questions where we didn't feel like we had enough variation, we just excluded them from the data set, but that was kind of an interesting one, I thought. So what I want to focus on are the things that mattered in the data, things that didn't appear to matter in pen gestation, which is also just as interesting probably to a lot of you, and some of the things that surprised me and surprised our team based on what we would have expected. This is just an example of the way a lot of these results slides you're going to see next are set up. Along the vertical axis, we have sow mortality, and that's the case in about all the pictures. On the horizontal axis is mated sow inventory for this variable. You can see that for mated inventory, the R correlation was pretty weak at 0.236, and it was not significant, but each of the black data points were sow farms that provided an answer that was qualified and within 3 standard deviations in each of these results. Since I'm going to focus on sow mortality, I thought it was good to point out that sow mortality was highly correlated to pigs per mated female per year and to farrowing rate. I don't think that surprises a lot of you, but maybe helps you see that using sow mortality for a lot of these variables is a pretty good indication of the farms being better on these other factors as well. So first of all, I want to start with what didn't appear to matter, at least in our data set. As far as general farm info, I'm going to pull out some of the key takeaways or key things that I think stood out in the data set, but for these variables, mated sow inventory, farm age, years of the farm having open pen gestation, and sow to staff ratio, as well as batch versus weekly flow, we did not see any significant differences for the farms as far as those factors on sow mortality. So, I highlighted one that I'm showing here is staff per sow. Find this pretty interesting, but in our data set, there was no correlation between sows per person and sow mortality. If we look at pen gestation info, some of the factors that didn't appear to matter, fully or partially slatted, pen size, square foot per sow in pens, and hospital size and location, as well as gilt pre-training techniques. You can see as we break these down in a little bit more detail, might be a little bit small for some of you, but you can see on a square foot per sow basis, this is one of the key questions we get on pen design is what square foot do we need to have? And if you're not Prop 12 at 24 square feet, a lot of times we're just trying to make sure we keep our inventory if it's a retrofit and not build a barn bigger than we need to on a new construction. Pretty interesting that this data set doesn't appear to show a strong correlation to added square footage on reducing sow mortality, although it is weakly correlated. If we look at hospital location, this is one that I would say I generally recommend having hospital spaces within the pen, but our data, at least from the results, would show here that if you have hospital in the same barn or even in a separate barn, as long as you have hospital area, you're probably not going to see a big difference in sow mortality. For us as an ESF system, we get lots of questions about how much pre-training do the gilts need to have before they're exposed to the system. And we looked at the different ways that people are doing pre-training or none. Again, no strong correlation to pre-training techniques on sow mortality, which, again, fairly interesting. Sows per pen. We vary this depending on the farm and the flow, but looks like pen size within the normal range that we tend to run into of about 25 to 75 sows per pen, no difference in sow mortality. So if we move on from the things that didn't matter to maybe some of the things that did stand out as making a difference in pen gestation, I don't think many of you would be surprised that the farms that were stable but positive for PRRS or positive right now, they had significantly higher sow mortality than sow farms that were negative. And as I already told you, we excluded a lot of farms that were recently positive for PRRS. Injections per week. This is one of the questions that I think if we could go back and do differently, we probably would. Didn't get this adjusted for sow farm size, but we did see some widely different answers in terms of injections per farm per week. And so I think some of those high numbers really skewed the result there, but interesting that we had such a variation in number of injections per week. One of the big questions that we tend to get asked is, do genetics matter on sow mortality in pens? From this data, we had 10 different genetic lines represented from a lot of the major genetic companies, both multiplication as well as commercial lines. It does look like we saw some key differences in genetic lines, but we've disguised those for the sakes of this conversation. When we get into the pen gestation info, one of the things that I was really surprised to see, I generally recommend that if you're forming pens into pen gestation, you form that pen within 24 hours so that you establish the dominance hierarchy quickly. At least in our data set, the sow farms that didn't necessarily get their pens formed within 24 hours actually had significantly lower sow mortality. So that was one that really kind of disagreed with what my preconceived notion would have been. Along with that, visits per sow per day to the feed station. This is generally one of the first things we see when we log into a farm. If we've got a farm with aggression problems or behavior problems, they're visiting the station more times per day. Looks like that generally agrees with the data we had here. The more visits per day, the higher the sow mortality, although it was a relatively weak correlation. Gestation grouping. We generally recommend segregating old versus young sows. A lot of our farms will segregate gilts just because of the way they flow, but we do have a decent amount of farms that have to mix sows, even young and old sows. And at least in the data here, we didn't see big differences between those that mixed parities with those that segregated young and old sows. And I would say that differs from the literature, but that's part of the reason why we do these types of surveys. A couple of the really interesting points are these last two. This is one that I would say many of you might disagree with or be surprised to see, but we did have Prop 12 farms in this data set. I'll show you some data on the next slide from Prop 12, but you can see when the sows were mixed into pens were strongly correlated to sow mortality. So actually the earlier they were mixed in pens in this data set resulted in lower sow mortality. The later they were mixed, we actually had higher recorded sow mortality, which again surprised us. Most of our farms were avoiding that critical period between, say, day 5 and day 25, but some of those that mixed right after breeding, a lot of our Prop 12 farms actually had pretty low sow mortality. Along with that, one of the things that I think we can use in reviewing our customers is the percentage of sows in pen gestation eating per day. We can easily pull that data in the Gestal system, and you can see the closer to 100% of those sows eating out of the system each day in pen gestation was a good indicator for lower sow mortality. So for some of the things that surprised us as we get towards wrapping up this, I was surprised to see that the hospital pens versus stalls didn't show much of a difference, and the location of the hospital areas was not really correlated with sow mortality. We were also surprised that early mixing into OPG actually showed reduced sow mortality. And particularly when we look at the Prop 12 compliant farms versus the traditional OPG post-preg check farms, pulled that data separately. We had 12 farms of the 38 participants that were Prop 12 compliant and 26 that were just moving after preg check. Pretty interesting here. I don't know that there's enough data to put a ton of stock in this, but at least it came as a surprise to me that I would say at least the Prop 12 farms were not significantly poorer in really any of these categories. And I think some of you guys in the audience might be a little surprised to hear that too. You think the longer they're in pens, the more likely we're gonna have more fallout, more mortality. At least in this data set, we didn't really see that. Stocking density mattered a little bit less than we thought. So being at 17, 18, 19 square feet didn't seem to be significantly worse than being at 22 or 23 or 24 square feet. And for pre-training and ESF systems, we didn't really see a major benefit to them having a pre-experience with a system like Gestal or Crate. For those of you that have partially solid floors, older barns that may need to retrofit at some point, you can take some stock in the fact that we didn't see a difference in sow mortality with partially slatted floors. A lot of us hate seeing the optics of those pens and the hygiene in those pens, but at least from a sow mortality standpoint, it didn't appear to really impact performance. And surprisingly, no difference between mixing sows and gilts versus grouping them separately. I'm really interested in getting more data on the impact of grouping sows within the first 24 hours because I would have strongly believed that that would have made a difference. And interestingly, 10 of our 38 sow farms in the survey reported that they did not get every sow up in pen gestation every day. That's a general, starting point for a lot of farms. But in those farms that didn't get sows up every day, we saw no difference in sow mortality. So maybe that's something we could reduce labor on if that's really true in a larger data set. So to wrap up the next steps for us as we look at this data a little bit more, we got a lot of data. I think my colleague Dalton sent me like 500 box plots and correlation charts. So I was trying to pull the important ones for this short conversation. But I think you guys got to hear some of the key things that really we lean on for what's important for pen gestation success. We're going to develop some individualized reports to go back to our sow farm participants. Some of you in the audience participated in this survey, and we want to give you detail on where you stand relative to others. We are open to surveying additional sow farms in our data set or others that come to us. And maybe in the future we could compare not just our feeding system, but that amongst other pen gestation systems. But since we haven't really seen any survey data on pen gestation in about 15 years, it's nice to have some new data on pen gestated sows. And once again, appreciate the opportunity to show this to you. I'll be quick, but I'd like to thank again all the farms that participated in this survey, as well as my team for helping us collect the data, and for Dr. Dalton Obermeyer who helped us with the analysis. And with that, look forward to the panel discussion, and thank you for your time.